Глубоко уважаемый профессор Катапано Александр Олегович, уважаемые члены ученого совета, у нас сегодня очень знаменательный день. На заседании ученого совета Национального медицинско-исследовательского центра мы впервые в нашей истории вручаем диплом приглашенного профессора, профессору Альберико Катапано, Италия, Милан. Мы давно знаем профессора Катапано как одного из выдающихся исследователей в области кардиологии, нарушений липидного обмена, бывшего президента Европейского общества по изучению атеросклероза, автора многочисленных фундаментальных и трансляционных исследований в области липидологии. И для нас высокая честь, что профессор Катапано стал лауреатом этого диплома и стал приглашенным профессором. Мы очень надеемся, что это станет очень важным шагом в развитии, Александр Олегович, вы тогда переведете, в развитии наших отношений, нашего центра. Очень важно, что профессор Катапано всегда, в общем, был нацелен на образование. Он был деканом факультета в Миланском университете, и это тоже очень важная черта характера, которая нацелена именно на развитие молодежи, на талантливой молодежи. И я думаю, что наши проекты совместно с Миланским университетом, они тоже позволят нашим молодым коллегам проявить себя в этом очень важном и нужном направлении. Мы рассчитываем, что и многие наши будущие проекты в области липидологии, атеросклероза, кардиологии, в области генетики, они тоже будут реализованы при участии профессора Катапано. И я от всех нас с удовольствием хочу вручить этот диплом. My congratulations, dear Professor Katapană. It's really very honor for us to have you as an invited professor in our center, and we are looking in our future to increase our activities, to increase our educational field. Thank you very much. И позвольте предоставить слово для лекции профессора Катапано и рекомендации Европейского кардиологического общества по диагностике и лечению дислипидемии, текущий статус и перспективы. Пожалуйста. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Schlanto. Good afternoon, everyone. I've been asked to give a presentation today on the European guidelines in plasma lipid control and what is the status and future challenges. This is my conflict of interest. Now, to get started and frame the scopus and the remit of the European guidelines, I wish to go back to one point, that is, all the guidelines on lipid control are centered on the evidence that is available nowadays on the role of lipoproteins in atherosclerosis, specifically LDL. And this slide just depicts for you the kind of evidence that is available, from genomics and genetics to epidemiology to pathology to interventional trials, and how LDL are involved in atherogenesis, because they do play a role throughout the whole pathway from the starting point of inducing early lipid accumulation within the arterial wall, further down to the point where cholesterol crystals accumulate and are instrumentals in making inflammatory responses, in making the plaque to rupture, and to have overt cardiovascular events. Now, one other point that is important is the consistency of epidemiological data. This is one of the main studies published all over the world on the role of LDL as a risk factor. And the reason why I've been putting here this slide is here, because people think, looking at the slopes, that the LDL becomes less and less of a risk factor for cardiovascular events as you grow older, which is not the case if you look carefully to this slide. Because yes, the slope is different, in younger is much steeper as compared to the elderly. But please note this is semi-logarithmic scale. So here you go from 1 to 8, more or less. Here you go from 160 or something like that, if I recall, 128 to twice as much. Certainly, the degree here of growth is 1 to 8, and if you make in relative terms, is 1 to 2. But in actual numbers, it's from 126 to 240. So it's much larger here even. So the number of events is higher as you grow older, as you know, and still cholesterol is a risk factor. The other important point I wanted to show you is this one, and that depicts what is happening with the trials. I'm not going to discuss, unless we do that in the discussion, the CETP inhibitors. But independent of that approach, pharmacological approach, all the approaches that have been used to reduce LDL are more or less in line with the concept that the more you reduce the LDL, the higher will be the benefit when you normalize studies to 5 years of exposure. This means that the LDL reduction is nothing magic. There is no magic drug there, but the results are coming from the reduction of LDL. Second, you have to comply with this analysis that is coming from the CTT meta-analysis from Oxford, indicating that risk, absolute risk, and LDL go hand in hand. What does that mean? It does mean that the absolute risk is determining the rate of events, but the LDL is modulating this as well. So people with high LDL and very high risk will benefit if you have a reduction of 2 millimoles, much more than people who have only high LDL. And the same is true if you do the calculation for low risk, low LDL, you see here. So this gradient is driven not only by the degree of reduction of LDL, but also by the level of starting risk. In other words, with the same reduction of LDL, in relative terms, you get always the same benefit. In absolute terms, the reduction is larger if you start with higher risk. Just to make it simple, 20% of a large number is a large number, 20% of a small number is a small number. As simple as that. Now, these are the guidelines. The last version we had in 2016. The new guidelines will be published shortly in August at the European Society of Cardiology meeting in Paris. And I can't comment on the contents because, as usual, top secret. So, the concept of total cardiovascular risk we have seen. We have to admit that calculating total cardiovascular risk is quite a challenge. At population level, like the scoring system, it might work. When you go to the individual, things are more difficult. However, this is one of the best ways we have to approach, especially in primary prevention, and is integrating the different known risk factors that have been measured in population studies. And you can see here what is happening. Sex will make a difference, being smoker, non-smoker will make a difference, having high blood pressure and high cholesterol will make a difference. The more red the color, the higher will be the risk. However, this is crystal clear here that the older you are, age plays a key role. So the older you are, the higher will be the risk. So how to compensate with that? We tried to do the relative risk charts, comparing people healthy for a given age to people who have bad behaviors, like smoking and having high LDL and high blood pressure. The relative risk will be 12 times increased in a subject like this as compared to a subject like this. Or to have the relative age concept. That is, a person here compares for his risk factors that put him at this risk level to a person here with lower risk factors levels. So this is a 20 years difference of age. So you can tell the people you are 20 years older than you should when you have 40 and you bring all these risk factors. Then other factors play a role. Yes, the HDL, we have incorporated that into the charts. So HDL will modulate the risk according to the levels. The lower the HDL, the higher the risk, and vice versa. Who is a qualifier for getting into this risk chart? First of all, has to be primary prevention. Second, risk is overestimating depending on the countries where you go. There are countries where the risk is lower, so you have to cope with that. In women than in men, the risk is lower, but then as you grow older, as women, the risk of developing cardiovascular event is higher. Ultimately, more women will die of cardiovascular events as compared to men. This is overall shown in many, many countries. And there are other factors for young fellows who might have very high and genetically determined levels of a risk factor. And there are other factors that modify the risk scores, like very well-known factors like social deprivation, that is being out of a job, poor education, and living in a specific part of countries which are underdeveloped, physical inactivity, stresses, you name it, and they are listed in this slide. So, in the end, we have categorized by risk the population, where you go from the very high risk, where there are subjects with documented cardiovascular disease essentially, or diabetes mellitus with target organ damage, or people with severe chronic kidney disease, or a very high score, which is quite unusual in the population. And then you go down to high risk subjects who are at the border between primary and secondary prevention, with markedly elevated single risk factors, people with diabetes but no organ damage, moderate CKD, or a score between 5 and 10. And then you go to the bulk of the population, which actually is in this area at moderate or lower risk. So what is the treatment target? As a consequence of what I told you is the LDL. This is the table from the guidelines. And you can see here we have made the intervention modulated according to the risk. In other words, we are aiming to a more intensive therapy as the risk is higher, to get to the most of the benefit out of it, according to the fact that if you have higher risk and you reduce the LDL, you get a larger absolute benefit. And you can see here the concept of a goal below 70 milligrams, or a reduction of at least 50% if you are in a given area. If you are very high, patients at high risk, the goal is below 100, or 50% if you have this range of LDL to start with, and moderate risk below 3 millimoles. Please note here that 115 milligrams per deciliter is more or less 10 to 15% less than the average LDL in the free-living population, which is usually at low moderate risk. So those are reduction that can be achieved without drug intervention, but you can achieve essentially by lifestyle changes and dietary modifications. What also for the other parameters? Well, non-HDL and ApoB have been highlighted, and you will see that in a minute, how it's important. And HDL cholesterol is not recommended as a target for treatment. This is a standing point we took already in 2012, and things are developing more and more in this area, suggesting what we said was quite right. I mean, HDL are not being a target anymore, contemporary target for reduction. We do not suggest to use the ratios as well, but that's for statistical issues. Whatever you wish to say, this is the pillar of the guidelines. This is the table that recapitulates the concept. When it contrasts the LDL goals with the class of, with the level of risk. You can see here, the higher the risk, the more intensive will be the therapy, suggesting immediate intervention, even if you have an LDL that is above 100 here, and consider the drug even if you have a level above 70, because the goal is below 70. And so you go on. As the risk goes lower, only lifestyle advice is suggested, because that will take care of it. For low-risk people, you consider already here the possibility of drug, because above 190 milligram per deciliter, or 4.9 millimoles, 5 millimoles of LDL cholesterol, the likelihood of having genetically determined high LDL is quite high. In other words, familial hypercholesterolemia. Lifestyle modification, what we suggest? Well, nothing really novel. You can find that almost everywhere. So be careful, healthy food choices. But what we do not claim is a given amount of food per day, because that's very difficult to follow. We maintain the concept that you should choose healthier foods as compared to the others, because the benefit is not necessarily coming from one component from the food, but from the type of food you are eating. The other point we are addressing here in the lifestyle, and we state that very carefully there, is not just a matter of what you choose, but is also a matter of how much you eat. In other words, if it's an healthy food, but you eat a lot, you will gain weight anyhow. And the goal is to keep the weight constant, possibly in the proper range. Now, as far as treatment, then you have this scale here. Statins are the first choice for several reasons. All the trials are indicating that trials are effective and so on. So the evidence is so large that you can't take anything but statins at the first point. If the goal is not reached, you can consider cholesterol absorption inhibitors, such as ezetimibe, for instance, of ion exchange. And then, at very high-risk people who do not reach the goal and are far from that goal, we suggested to consider PCSK9 inhibitors. Please bear in mind that these guidelines were released before the data from the Odyssey and Fourier trial with evolocumab and alirocumab were released. So the new guidelines will have to take that in account. So that explains to you how to move here. Essentially, the first starting drug will be a statin, preferably a higher potency statin, such as atorva and rosuvastatin, but not necessarily those. And then these are the goals that we have set. So how to reach them depends on the type of patient, how distant they are from the goal, and you can make those calculations. The guidelines also take into account the management of this lipidemia in different settings, because we have to bear in mind we have patient in front of us is not just an average person. And we have made a list of things we went through. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I just wanted to highlight for you some of the points. For instance, we paid a lot of attention on familial hypercholesterolemia. Contemporary data are indicating that 1 out of 200, 1 out to 250 people in the population, the free living population, carry an FH. So they have familial hypercholesterolemia. So we suggest them as a high risk or very high risk subject, depending on the clinical condition, and they should be treated as soon as possible. And also to take advantage of the family, because being a codominant disease, you can find the heterozygotes, of course, but is present in every generation of the family. So if you have a person having the disease, then either father or mother should have it. Then women. We stated, and correctly so, and this has been proven over and over in recent years, that women benefit as much as men from therapy. It's just a matter of when you start. Of course, women before menopause are usually at very low risk, so there is no reason to start treating unless they are affected by a specific condition like FH. However, when they are at risk, they have exactly the same benefit as human beings, as males. Older adults. We stated that the benefit is the same, and we were also right there. Just last month, a meta-analysis from all the trials with statin had appeared with people up to 85 years of age, and again, the benefit is exactly the same. The only caveat with older people is the kidney and liver function, as it is decreasing with age, as you know. And some the statins are metabolized either by the liver or by excreted by the kidney. So you have to be careful. And the suggestion was not to start immediately with a very high dose, but started with a moderate dose and then increase as tolerability is there. And then the point of type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. Why this is important? Because in these subjects, usually you have a moderate increase of LDL, but you have a large increase in ApoB. There is this disproportionate effect there, which is due to the accumulation of VLDL and VLDL remnants. So that's why we suggested there, as a secondary goal objective, the non-HDL or the ApoB. Why is it so? Because non-HDL or ApoB recapitulates all the atherogenic lipoproteins in a better way in these subjects than LDL, because there are other atherogenic lipoproteins that are accumulating. In a normal population, usually is not much of a difference because LDL captures more or less the whole information. However, in diabetics and metabolic syndrome patients, this is not the case. Finally, these are the points, as I said, and chronic kidney disease. Chronic kidney disease is more difficult to deal with because you have to be balanced there, and the evidence is it's a very severe chronic kidney disease, and in people in dialysis, the benefit is fading away. So if you are in dialysis, you have a patient in dialysis, lipid lowering, cholesterol lowering treatment is not recommended, and most of the benefit will come with people with a GFR between 50 and 30. Below that, the benefit starts to decline, but still is there until you get to dialysis. Now, having said that, what are the future challenges? I tried to point a few of them. I will go through them quite rapidly. Lifetime risk. Now, as you saw from the score, we start from 40, we get to 65, we will have the 75 this year. However, it's a 10 years perspective. And essentially, when you are older, the likelihood you will die for some reason is higher if you are 75 as compared to being 40. So inevitably, you will be at lower risk if you are younger. If you make the area under the curve, the lifetime risk, things are different, and you can spot the people there. How can you do that? Well, this has to do with the total cardiovascular risk, as I mentioned, and with the fact that we have only 10-year perspective there. And this is the risk age concept, in a way, being translated here, as I mentioned. Well, nature has told us something. If you look at the lifetime variation in CHD risk, and this is a sort of Mendelian randomization, if you wish, this is the effect of single polymorphism on the LDL cholesterol, and this is the effect on the size of effect. Well, you cannot see there, I can see it here though. This is the size of effect you have on the benefit of cardiovascular events. So it goes hand in hand, the effect on LDL cholesterol and the association with CHD, informing us that there is a benefit that is present there according to the different polymorphisms. With small changes of an LDL, you see larger changes throughout life, because these are observations for 56 years as an average. What is an example? Well, FH. We know with FH, if you take the green curve, this is a normal population, and they hit the threshold for the disease around, say, 55, 60 years, the first experience of the disease, cardiovascular disease. But the red one is the heterozygous FH, who started with higher LDL since inception, and then the homozygous, which is much rarer, but a very steep relationship. So they get to the disease as an average 15 or even 40 years before the average population for the homozygotes. Can you change the trajectory? Yes, that has been documented. You can change the trajectory of the disease, and depends when you start and how intensive you are. And the two different lines there are demonstrating in a schematic way for you the story. But even better, if you look at the genetics, the last part down here is the median follow-up of 5 years with randomized clinical trials. And here is the reduction of LDL as a median over time. And you can see here, well, the slide is just mixed up somehow, but you can see the decrease in LDL cholesterol. When you see the one there with the blue line is 1 millimole reduction. And you can see there the studies from observational study, the green line, 12 years follow-up. and then the genetic follow-up with Mendelian randomization approach for 52 years. And you can see the slopes are completely different. In trials, you can reduce with 1 millimole reduction of LDL cholesterol, 39, 40 milligrams per deciliter, about 22% the risk. But if you have 1 millimole reduction in follow-up studies in population for 12 years, you get a reduction of 33%. And if you have 1 millimole reduction due to the genetics, so an observation lifelong, you get a reduction of 56, indicating, therefore, that longer you stay exposed to lower levels of LDL, the larger will be the benefit. This is a big implication, because that will mean if you start even with only a statin early, you will get the benefit that you can have in a secondary prevention with hammering the LDL cholesterol and reducing it to very low levels. And this is something that is a challenge for the guidelines. What do you recommend? To start early, or you recommend to start when the disease is overt and clean? Perhaps both approaches have to be taken care of, because we will never be without people having had a myocardial infarction, but we can improve the approach in primary prevention. The second is the HDL. As I mentioned to you before, the HDL is under scrutiny. These are the data that have been published over and over, the relationship of HDL with cardiovascular events. The lower the HDL, the higher the risk. Please note that those studies got up to 75, 80 milligrams per deciliter LDL. That was all the data presented from the large random trials, observational studies. However, more recently, this is one of 4 different papers from different parts of the world. People have been able to show, look at over there, the high part, that if you look at the HDL, you get a sort of U-shaped curve when you go high with the LDL, above 70, 80 milligrams per deciliter, which was never taken into account in the epidemiological study because they were so few. So if you look at larger data, you can see that U-shaped curve. It looks like if you have higher level of HDL, not always, you will be in good shape. And most of those people there have genetic forms of depicting the high HDL, which might interfere with HDL functionality. Non-HDL in everybody. This is again from a large epidemiological study, and if you look at the non-HDL on the right-hand panel, you can see the sustained continuous relationship with cardiovascular disease even after correction for many variables. So is the non-HDL adequate? Well, looks like to be, and is even better than LDL. And this is true also if you look at the European population and compare the non-HDL with ApoB. More or less, they give you the same information. All the heterogenic lipoproteins that are the ApoB-containing lipoprotein are captured by the non-HDL or ApoB. And this is important. Why? Because if you look here, it's a very simple observation. Increased triglyceride, you have the number of observations there. You can see there what accumulates is not the LDL as you increase the triglyceride. So the cholesterol carried in VLDL, which is reflected by the triglyceride accumulation, gets larger, and those are what has been named remnant lipoproteins, and they get larger. But both the orange and the red bar are giving you the same information, ApoB-containing lipoproteins. So that's why we consider the non-HDL and the ApoB should be considered. And this has been supported by the very recent paper we published. This appeared in JAMA last month. Brian is the first author. I'm the senior author in this paper. There is a log linear relationship between changes in ApoB and CHD from genetics. So everything that captures ApoB information gives you a straight line. The more you decrease ApoB, or the more you increase, you get more disease or less disease. And then, if you make a multivariable Mendelian randomization study, and you put in triglyceride, which has been in many studies shown to be related to the disease, you put in LDL cholesterol and ApoB, the only one that survives in Mendelian randomization is the ApoB, because it is better in informing you about the risk than LDL cholesterol and triglycerides. So that's why we had moved towards that direction. And probably in the future, non-HDL or ApoB will be something we will have to consider for the guidelines. Percent reduction versus goals. To make a long story short, I'm not going to enter this, but the concept is very easy, and it's this one. Now, if you decrease by 25% and you start at 160 milligrams per deciliter of LDL, a decrease like this will be 40 milligrams per deciliter, so 1 millimole. And you get a reduction here of 20% of 3% in absolute risk. The same reduction, 25% starting from here and going there, is much less. So you get much less benefit. In absolute terms, you get a reduction of 0.8. That's all you can get, as simple as that. So percent is important, but it depends where you start from. And that's very important, because you need an absolute reduction to get the benefit. So you need to have both a percentage reduction as well as an absolute reduction as a minimum. If you want a 23% reduction, you need to have at least 1 millimole reduction for cardiovascular events, not for LDL. And that has to do with the trial design. First of all, looks at that data from the CTT meta-analysis. Now, in contemporary studies, it has been shown that in the first year of statin treatment, the benefit is not as much as you would expect. There is a sort of delay in getting the benefit that fades away after the first year. So here is about half of the benefit you will get at full gear here, which is a 23% reduction of cardiovascular events by 1 millimole reduction of LDL. How contemporary trials are coping with that? Well, let's look at the Fourier, for instance. The Fourier with the evolocumab. The Fourier lasted a little bit more than 2 years. You get dramatic reduction, but you started with a relatively low LDL, placebo, median 2.3, and you went down about 60%. So the absolute reduction was about 145. So 60 milligram, 55 milligrams per deciliter of LDL cholesterol, which percentage-wise is very large, is 60%, but you started with a relatively low level of LDL to begin with. And these are the results obtained. And people say, oh, okay, there is no benefit there, there is less than expected. It's not the case. It's not the case, because the same happened with ezetimibe, with Improvit. Low LDL reduction, low benefit, but still in line with what you expected. And this was a 7-year trial, adjusted here for 5 years. But then if you look at these more recent trials with PCSK9 inhibitors, you can see here, they last 2 years. And now, if you put these lines in a graph like here, this is the CTT meta-analysis. This is what you would expect from 1 year benefit. This is what we would expect for 2 years, 3 years, and then full gear here. Why 2 years is less? Well, because you have to discount this one. When you accumulate more years, then you have to discount much less the first year. So, in other words, 2 years of treatment will be an average between the benefit of first year and second year. And that has to be taken into account. And if you put the Fourier, the Odyssey, the Spire, the 3 trials that have been carried over with PCSK9 inhibitors, they fell exactly where you would have expected them to do with the 2 years average treatment, or a little bit more than that. So again, it's not a lack of effectiveness, it's the way the trials are designed that take you to get some results. And people have difficulties in understanding this, but there are reasons for the data that we have seen. And again, you can see that over here, Fourier, Odyssey, and Spire, the meta-analysis here, they get exactly where they should be, given the time of treatment. The other point that guidelines will have to face how low to go, because with these trials we went very low, and we got the population here, you see. Now we have people with 20, 25 milligram per deciliter LDL, and the point has been, will they benefit? Will they stay there? Well, apparently they have more benefit, as we saw in the first slide, and there is no safety issue. Whether the gain is worth it to push so much to go down is not completely clear. However, this is the relationship, down to 10 milligram per deciliter LDL, and it's safe because it's been demonstrated. So whether you want to go there by pushing is a point of discussion. Whether getting there and having troubles with safety is another argument that needs to be taken cautiously. But so far, there is no evidence of any harm. And that's why some guidelines have suggested an extreme risk population with a decrease of the goal below 40 milligrams per deciliter. What we have suggested is just to look at the benefit you can get for the statins, for instance, as an average. 50% reduction you can achieve with some statins, not others. But that's what we suggested, and that's what we had in the guidelines in terms of relative risk reduction and LDL reduction. Finally, and I'm closing with this slide, we tend to forget that if we don't take the drug, we don't get the benefit. There are some data indicating the placebo effect, but you need to take a pill anyhow, which is placebo in the randomized clinical trials. And if we forget that, everything I said is nil, because this is very old data, but still you get exactly the same from population and database analysis. This is the log rank with total mortality. This is survival. You can see here, high adherence to statin, more than 80%, intermediate 40 to 80, and low below 40. And this is over the years. And you can see here the difference in outcomes from people with high adherence to people with low adherence. This difference is exactly the same if you make the calculation that was observed in the 4S for the total mortality. The first trial with the statin, with simvastatin, with the 4S trial. It's a 40% difference there. What that happens? Because they didn't take the drug in this case. So if we prescribe a drug, but we don't insist the patient to take it and keep taking the drug, everything we say with the guidelines, with all the data, all the trials we run, will be essentially futile. Thank you very much for your attention, and please remember, if you have the chance to come to listen to our Congress in Maastricht this year, that will be a place where we will discuss further these points. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Katapano, for excellent lecture. Okay, Alexander.